morning to everyone who's joining us today and welcome. Please forgive me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold. So my voice might sound a little bit different today, but I just wanted to let you guys know I'm sorry. But thank you for being here. Please note today's webinar will be recorded and placed on our member portal for your reference after if you want to go back and watch it, share it with someone else. It can be found there on the resources tab under the video hub. So let's go ahead and get today started. So we're doing a Reach Tips training today. And today's topic is going to focus on community actions. This year, we really wanted to take our Reach Tips trainings in the direction of really getting back to basics. You know, what are the basics of Reach that maybe we can recover or cover in a more direct way? So today is going to be all about community actions and tracking those. We'll make sure to pause for questions as we go through today, so feel free to put anything in the chat that you have questions on, concerns about, and we'll make sure to kind of talk about those as we go as well. So let's look at our agenda. So today we're going to actually start with talking about what a community change is. So I know it's a little bit backwards, but before we get into what a community action is, I just want to kind of double check and just reaffirm that we all know what a community change is. So we're going to talk about that first. Then we're going to get into what is a community action. So if you don't know, or if you do know, we're going to kind of recover that. Then we're going to get into description must-haves. We're going to kind of talk about some description must-haves and get into the specifics of that and what they look like, what a description might look like, both bad and good. We're going to get into some tips and help. So this is going to be a little bit more of where today's going to be focused at, is the tips and help category, to really help you understand what is a community action when we get to the point of actually entering your own data, right? And then lastly, we'll leave time for any questions or examples that any attendees want to put into the chat box. So we'll have some time for that as well. So let's get into what is a community change first. Now, it is really important in my mind to know what a community change is before we actually get into talking about what a community action is. So we're just going to kind of briefly talk about this and just recap. Hopefully this is something you already know, but a community change is the implementation of a new or significantly modified policy, program, procedure, practice, partnership. And these are usually in the community designed to reduce substance use, abuse, misuse, and those big problem goals your organization is typically working on. Now, a lot of times when it comes to community changes and coalition work in general that we're tracking in Reach, we tend to get caught up in this place where we think of outcomes as community changes, and that's not necessarily the case. When we're looking at work as a prevention coalition and work in our community, we oftentimes are working towards outcomes. So what I mean by that is outcomes are going to be the results that basically we hope to see in our communities by conducting outputs, such as our accomplishment outputs like a community change. So when it comes to tracking our work in Reach, a lot of times we might think of, you know, well, we want to reduce underage drinking, or we're here to reduce the home access numbers for prescription drugs. Depending on what those type of outcomes are that we're trying to get to, kind of our goals, I like to call them, we need to implement work or activities or outputs as we track them or call them in Reach. And that's where community changes come into play. So it's really important to kind of know the difference between the two, because knowing what a community change is and that a community change can't be recorded without the coalition, or can't be done basically without the coalition, whether you guys were fully in charge of this community change, or maybe you were just partnering and helping. community changes are work of the coalition. They came out of the work you guys wanted to do and got done, basically. So making sure that we understand what a community change is really important in our topic today. Before I move any further, and I know we had a couple people kind of straggling late, does anyone have any questions so far or anything before we continue on to our next topic of what a community action is? So community changes, right? Pretty simple, self-explanatory, nothing too complicated. Now let's get into what a community action is. And like I said, this is why we're here today, right? We want to talk about community actions and really what they are, why we need to record them, and when to record them, right? So what is a community action? Down to our definition, it's really going to be things such as meetings, events, efforts, work that is intended to lead to a specific new or modified community change. So this is why it's really important to know what a community change is first, because if we don't, we really won't know if what we're doing is a community action, right? So making sure that we know that we're working towards a specific, policy change. Awesome, that's great. We know that we want to update this policy. We know it's going to be modified when it's done. And we can backtrack then every single meeting, event, effort, like it says here, and track those as actions. Now, the really important thing to remember when it comes to community actions is there's no limit, right? We can enter as many community actions as we please, and there might be certain things or certain work that we're doing that might take 2 months, 6 months, even a year to accomplish or to get to that community change point. So it's really important to keep track of our actions. And sometimes that could be, keeping track of them on a notebook off of Reach and putting them into Reach once they happen. And we'll kind of get into that, into some of the tips and tricks areas later. The community actions are usually always happening because a lot of times our work is focused on implementing these big changes and different things in our community that we need to track all the work we're doing towards it, right? And in case you didn't know, or in case you're kind of like, all right, it's great to track our community changes, right? Because those are big things that we've done. These are big policies, programs we're implementing. What's the big deal about community actions? If that's kind of your thought sometimes and you're like, I don't need to worry about community actions, they don't matter. At the end of the day, they really do. And the main reason community actions matter is to be able to show your contribution towards change. Because at the end of the day, your grant that you might write, your report that you might write will look super great and say that you probably did all these community changes, you passed all these policies, you implemented all these programs. But if you go back and look at the work, do you have the ability to prove how you made those changes happen? Can you back up those changes with, meeting minutes, maybe an event, maybe some emails, maybe some research you had, can you back those community changes up with action? It's kind of like, I like to say in math class back when you're in elementary school and all the teachers make you show your work, right? If you're doing multiplication, division, whatever, they're like, you got to show your work. Same thing when it comes to our type of coalition work that we're doing with our communities. You got to be able to show your work and show how you got to some of these changes. It could help other communities replicate the same changes you got to. B, it could help with funding. Funders like to see your actions, and that, just because you're getting changes is great, but how are you getting there? Is it taking this many steps, or what steps did they take along the way? So definitely don't count community actions out. They're very important. And they're really kind of the backbone to the coalition's work and what you guys see get accomplished over the years, right? So that is really what is a community action? Why is it important? Why should we be recording those? Now let's get into description must-haves. So when we talk about reach, a lot of times where we tend to see people get tripped up within the system and with tracking data is going to be in the description area. And I'm going to tell you guys, you're never alone. This happens to everyone, even a seasoned veteran who's maybe been doing reach for 8 years. It happens, and that's okay. So today we're really going to kind of talk about the general must-haves for a community action specifically. So when we're looking at writing a description, and we already know that the event we need to record is a community action, we've already made that decision. We then get into, okay, how do we write our description to make sure that this demonstrates that it is a community action, right? Because I know everyone's probably gotten that message that says, please add to the description how this is a community action. We see that happen all too often, and that's okay. And the easiest way to help you guys get to a point where you are getting your descriptions in a place that are getting accepted and or have the information they need, we need to see really a couple main things from that description. Don't ever count out the standards. So the who, what, when, kind of what substance, those are your three main you should always start out with any reach entry. When it comes to community action specifically, though, we like to see first off, what is the specific community change that this action is working towards? You'll probably see that a lot. If you're recording a community action, you might see the other comment of, please add to the description, what community change this action is working towards. Sometimes that's something as simple as adding in 1 or 2 words. I'm not even kidding you. I've seen a lot of clients just miss 1 word or forget to include the words such as new or modified in their description. Little things like that are really important when it comes to community actions and changes, and we're really particular on how you guys write those because we want to make sure you guys are getting credit where credit's due, and we want to make sure that it's not something that's already been done before that we're trying to kind of double count because we don't want to see that come through, right? So first things first, yes, we want to know what the specific change is this action is working towards. Sometimes including the words such as new or modified is the easiest way to do that. Other times it might be including the actual thing that you're working on. So if you don't put that you're working towards a new policy and that you just had a meeting and you're trying to record it as a community action, it's probably going to get caught up. It's going to get marked as needs attention. So sometimes just including those big key words like new policy, modified practices, new programs, new organization, new partnership. Sometimes something as simple as that can help clear up your description really easily. All right. Virgil commented and said, I have the habit of writing first time ever instead of new. Molly accepts that wording. Exactly. And some people do. Oh, this is Jackie. Perfect. So some people do have different ways of writing things because it makes sense for their coalition. Especially you guys, Jackie, you guys have been around for a couple of years. You do quite a bit of activities and events within the community. So it's definitely helpful for wording such as new, or like Jackie said, first time ever. So if it's the first time your coalition has ever passed out prescription drug disposal boxes at your event, that is something that, yes, would definitely be accepted. That wording definitely works. So thank you, Jackie, for that. That's a great point. Another key thing to include in your description or to remember is making sure to include who is involved. Sometimes we get into a rabbit hole of just kind of short wording things and saying, the school board or the county. Some of you might work in different counties. Some of you might work in different cities. Some of you might work with different partnerships with different people. And that kind of gets into the last part down here is who are you doing this with? Where is this community change going to take place once it gets implemented? because community actions and changes are very specific to location, we like to say. So basically what that means is when you have a countywide coalition, you could have a business on the north side of town implement a policy while working on that same policy at another business on the south side of town who decides not to pass that policy. You want to make sure that as you're working on a policy in both businesses, you're tracking them separately because they don't coincide together. Obviously, unless they're owned by the same person, then that gets down a little bit of a different hole. If they can get approved by the same person, you can keep them together basically. If not, and they're two completely separate entities, we want to keep those separated because they're separated by location / business / organization and whoever's going to be implementing those. With that being said, I'm going to quickly get into one of my samples we're going to take a look at. So I have seen something like this before, and it was a couple of years ago, so it wasn't anyone recently, so don't feel like it's you if you think it is. But I've seen something like had a meeting with the local school board to discuss student policies and procedures. Some of you might be saying, oh yeah, that's not bad. She talks about student policies, procedures. However, in my mind, nowhere in here does she say that they're working towards a new policy or a new procedure. It doesn't even honestly say what school board, it just says the local school board. So that's where we get into that shorthand issue. It doesn't even say how many people, how long the meeting was. So while it's not bad, it has the beginnings of a good entry. There's some additional things that I kind of think could be added to make this better. So you're not having to see that needs attention mark and fix it and resubmit. So it's still quite a short description, but I had a chat with her and we decided to come up with something like this. Had a 1-hour meeting, with 4 Jamestown local school board officials to discuss these student conduct policies around substance use and the possibilities of modifying the policy to now include vaping devices. That sounds a lot different than the other sentence she had above there. And it tells me a lot more of what's going on and what the coalition is working to implement and to change, right? So this is a type of description I would be okay with. She says how it's going to be a modified policy. We don't see this too much, but a lot of times if there's already policies, programs, or procedures in place and the coalition's working on significant modification of some of those, we can see those as community actions and changes. So in this case, that's what they had. They were working on modifying the substance use policy so they could start including vaping devices in that and what that was going to look like. So sometimes, like I said, just adding, in this case, she added the 1-hour meeting, 4, she added Jamestown for the local school board, and then just added this little bit down here about, substance use, modifying this policy to include this. It's so much more clear. She can link this to her problem goals she's working on, and it paints a clearer picture at the end of the day. Once we know that this policy gets modified, maybe, then we know it's a community change. So definitely just kind of some different things to keep in mind when we're writing our descriptions. Like I said, more isn't always better, but being specific and really thinking through what we need to have in an entry is really helpful. All right, Jackie, I believe this is still Jackie, also wrote, why write the number in attendance since it is collected in another field? Just need clarification. Sometimes it's helpful because some people will record things differently. Oh, it's Jen, okay. It just depends on how a coalition is recording things. Some coalitions will record things like meetings like this, Jen, as a volunteer time for those who attended. And it's helpful to know how many people were in attendance as volunteers. So that would kind of tell us, hey, there was 4 people there. It also might just be helpful for you guys if you're looking back on this and saying, gosh, how many people were even at that meeting? You know, who did we talk to? And coming back and looking at it and seeing the number 4, you might be able to go, oh yeah, it was the board president, you know, the board secretary, and be able to kind of refer back. It's not something that you would absolutely need, but depending on what you might be tracking this as elsewhere, it might be important. So we tracked hers, I believe, here as volunteer time, a community action. Yeah, those two. So she included that in there for it. So today I also want to talk about some tips / tricks, help, things that can be, I think, helpful in the long run when it comes to kind of planning as a coalition, and for you, those of you who do the REACH data entry. Now, some of these things you may have seen before. We're going to kind of talk about them in a little bit more depth today. So hopefully they kind of help. Maybe you adopt one of these with your coalition. Maybe you don't. That's okay. Maybe you adopt something similar. They're just kind of tips and help to help you guys moving forward with REACH entries and tracking community actions and the kind of change piece specifically. So I'm sure, as all of you, if you've gone through REACH training with me, or if you've looked at the REACH manual, have probably seen something along the lines of this slide. And we came up with this when we were creating the REACH manual because we think it can be kind of helpful in terms of a different way to look at community actions and changes in terms of kind of prepping our minds and prepping what we're going to be entering. And the reason I say that is because what we typically do is, if we take these or suggest using them with your coalition, we will actually suggest taking or clearing out these blue boxes and just writing in up here the intended community change we want to see happen. So a lot of times these might come from things like an action plan, from a work plan you guys might have that you want to, and things you guys want to accomplish. So we might put those up here in the gray box. And then a lot of times what we suggest doing is taking this to your coalition and saying, all right, we have identified these main things as accomplishments or community changes we want to see. For instance, let's go back to our school board modifying the policy to include e-cigarettes, vapes, those kind of things. We might say, all right, coalition members, this is what we want to see accomplished. Let's think through how we make that happen. And you guys would be surprised how often coalition members like this kind of interaction. It gives them guidance on saying, all right, if this is what we want to get to, how do we get there, right? Kind of backtracking our steps. This coalition came up with having coalition members meet with the school board to discuss modifying school substance policies to include nicotine products. They actually wanted coalition members present. They thought some of the parents might be better suited to speak on the topic. And that's one of the action items they came up with. The other one they came up with was the coalition sent out letters to parents of high schoolers and middle school students to ask for their support in modifying this school policy and to kind of, give their nod of acceptance to the board and saying, yes, we need this. We recommend the change. So that was another thing that their coalition came up with. And they came up with a couple more. Obviously, you can make this column as long as you want or as short as it might need to be, depending on the change you're trying to get to. But the nice thing is, for those of you who do the REACH entries, is that you now have a roadmap for when it comes time to entering data into the system. So you might have a roadmap that says, hey, one of our actions was meeting with the school board. Hey, our parents and coalition members just met with the school board last night. That is an action. I can record it as an action. So it's kind of the simultaneous of like checking it off our to-do list, as well as then putting it into REACH. And we know, since it's down here in a blue box, we know that it's community action and we can track it as such. So this is kind of one way that we tend to see this happen. Oh yeah, they came up with one more as well. sorry, but this is one way we've seen. We've also seen people do it in a column, but then number them as, what to do first, second, things they might have to circle back around to and do multiple times or come back to later. And another thing this is helpful for, if your coalition is really bad about delegating duties and who's going to do what, this can actually be really helpful in delegating who's going to be a part of each of these actions. We said coalition members here, who is that going to be? Is that going to be, Sue, Bob, and Sally? Is that going to be these other people? Who are we going to put in charge of making sure that this meeting takes place and is going to carry this out? Same thing with the letters, who's going to create the letter? Who's going to, send them out? Is it going to be digital? Is it going to be a handout? And making sure that we help assign people to do that work, even if it is sometimes supported by the coalition staff, that's still helpful to help make sure things are getting done. And again, same thing, when these actions get done, that they become community actions in the system. So it's really helpful in terms of kind of that roadmap. Another way to kind of look at it is creating like a story web. I think this is the easiest for me, simply because a lot of times community changes can have a lot of community actions, and I mean a lot. Depending on what you're trying to get done and how stubborn some people in your community might be, or your community itself, there might be 20 to 30 different things or steps you need to do to get to a change. So keep in mind that this is gonna all be subject to what your coalition is working on, and it can change too. So that's why I sometimes like this diagram set up better, because I can draw off as many, spider legs as I want, as many community actions as we may need and come up with. I also like the thought that we could have other community actions spur off of something that we've already done. So if we've already maybe had a meeting with the school board to discuss modifying this policy, and they want us to come back and give a presentation at the next board meeting, that could be an additional community action we need to do based off of some community action we've already done. So again, just another way to kind of diagram, plan, work with your coalition on this. It'll be a good tool for you as the staff, you as the data entry person at the end of the day. But in terms of getting your coalition on board, getting their buy-in, having them see the type of work that you guys are doing is really important, and it helps to have them in this planning process. Jackie, do you have these chart diagram ideas in template form that you can share with us? I most definitely can. I can make sure that those get sent out with the follow-up materials tomorrow, Jackie, definitely. This one is going to kind of be subject to, I'll make sure it's in a Word document form, because obviously on here you might be adding, like I said, 10 more spider arms, you might be only needing 3. So I'll make sure that we share those in a form that you guys kind of edit and use as needed. The last tip or helpful area I wanted to talk about, and we actually have a full webinar specifically on this topic. So if you are more interested in this, feel free to check out our video. I can share that as well. But the tip is to use your action plan, use your strategic, action, whatever kind of plan you guys use for the year to guide your work and to tell you what you guys are going to be doing or what's an issue in the community that needs to be addressed. Use it, because it's going to come up with good ways for you guys to track your data. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, like, what do you mean? How do I get community actions out of something like my action plan like this? Well, the key thing to keep in mind is, first things first, going back to my point earlier today on what is an output versus what is an outcome. So in this case, the outcome we're trying to get to is to decrease youth retail access to alcohol, right? We're trying to decrease that number. That's our outcome. We can't control that, but that's what we're trying to work towards with things that we can control, which is going to be our efforts, our accomplishments, our outputs. Now that we know that this is the output we're trying to get to, we can look at our activities under here as what does our coalition plan to do to get to that outcome, to achieve it? And that's going to come down to things like actions, changes, and that is where we're going to find these right here. A lot of times they get listed by strategy, which is super helpful for you folks, because when we're in Reach, we know we have to select a strategy, so we already know what it's going to be because it tells us on here. And then also knowing that, hey, we're creating and distributing local alcohol beverage laws and booklets. Again, might not always be a community action, might not always be a community change, but it's probably going to be at least one of our 5 output types, right? Because this is work that we're doing. So use your use your coalition's action plan as a guide to help give you guys a starting point to maybe then lead into one of those other diagrams I talked about. So being able to kind of pull out one of these activities, putting it in that gray box and saying, all right, to get this done, what do we got to do? And is this our first time doing it, right? Because remember, it's only probably going to be a community change if it's your first time doing it. Again, we have a whole video on kind of using your action plan to guide Reach entries as a whole. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check out our video hub on our website, because that video is really helpful. But you guys are free to go, and thank you for joining our webinar today.